River to the Statue of Liberty. I'm Ben Spagan, and I'm the Vice President at the JES, a nonpartisan think tank headquartered in Erie, Pennsylvania, offering world-class programming and publications worldwide. Joining me here is the Reverend Dr. Dave Ellingson, otherwise known as the Paddle Pilgrim. Dave will kayak us virtually through the history of the Erie Canal, the Hudson River, to the Statue of Liberty. We are about to see and experience from a water's eye view sights from the Second Great Awakening, women's suffrage, the Underground Railroad, the legends of Johnny Appleseed and the Headless Horseman, and how Clinton Ditch became an engineering marvel, providing a waterway for millions of immigrants, opening the West and shaping a great nation. Now, before I introduce our presenter just a bit more, I'm going to run through some housekeeping. We are hosting this event both on Zoom webinar and live streaming on the JES's Facebook page. Now, if you are joining us via Zoom in the webinar, please feel free to interact with us using the Q&A function, leaving any questions you might have there, because following the presentation, we will be taking questions from you, the viewers. Now, if you're tuning in via Facebook, leave your questions in the comments section. Right below on this post, because we're going to work through as many of the questions as we can following this presentation. Now, if you happen to be listening to or watching this program on demand at a later date, still send us your questions and comments to keep this conversation going, either on the JES's Facebook page or YouTube channel. And for more information about upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, connect with us on LinkedIn, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And now, a bit more about the Reverend Dr. Dave Ellingson before I turn it over to the Paddle Pilgrim himself. An adventurer, an author, and a speaker, Dave Ellingson is most well known for his Paddle Pilgrim books. He is a kayaker who's paddled the Mississippi River 2,350 miles, the Erie Canal, Hudson River to the Statue of Liberty, 500 miles, which we're here to learn about, fjords in Norway, and the Mekong River in Southeast Asia. He's also a Lutheran pastor, a professor, and he has served on college campuses and congregations in regional leadership. A master gardener, he has created rooftop gardens on college parking garages. A former distance runner, the Boston Marathon and Western States 100-mile endurance run and Hawaii Ironman triathlon. And he's a husband and father of 5 grown children and grandfather of 5, residing in Edmonds, Washington. We could, of course, be here all week discussing all of that and all that Dave does. But for the next hour, let's turn our attention to the Erie Canal, the Hudson River, the Statue of Liberty, that journey. Reverend Dr. Dave Ellingson, welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Ben, and to the JES for hosting this webinar and for the friendship and the partnership that we have created around my adventure. And I highly commend to anybody viewing, if this is the first exposure to JES, that you check out the organization and the good work that they're doing. And glad to be with you here today. I was just thinking to myself, why did I paddle? That's probably a question that some of you, and I'm going to answer that question very briefly with a song that I'd like you to join in with me on. Low bridge, everybody down. Low bridge, for we're going through a town. And you'll always know your neighbor. You'll always know your pal if you ever navigated on the. I know a bunch of you are singing Erie Canal. When I was a boy, my family, we lived along the Hudson River in a little town called Dobbs Ferry. And I had an uncle who taught at the University of Syracuse. Well, I learned that song in class in school. And when I went up to visit my uncle and my cousins and the family, I got to visit the Erie Canal and became fascinated with this incredible waterway through upstate New York. And so I knew that someday I would revisit it. I didn't know that I was going to paddle it, but I'm glad I did. And I'm glad to have you with me to paddle the Erie Canal and to learn about this incredible waterway. So that doesn't look much like a canal, does it? Well, that's lower in the canal because the canal has had 3 iterations, and I'll talk more about that as we move along. just a quick image of the Erie Canal flowing from by Lake Erie, by Buffalo, New York, all the way to Albany, New York, actually to Troy, New York. So that's 363 miles. And then about 150 miles down the Hudson River to New York City and the Statue of Liberty. That was the journey that I took. And I took it in this little craft. Actually, it's quite a large ocean kayak, 17 and a half feet long. I'm sure that's illegal. Don't bust me on this. It's way too big a boat. My friend met me at the end, and we loaded it on her car and took me, and I donated it to a camp that she's the director for in New Jersey. But that's the craft that took me down the Erie Canal. I like to begin the adventure with a quote from one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver. Mary says in one of her poems, "Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it." I think that's always been a motto for me, but even more so in my third act. I call my third act the period after I ceased gainful employment and taking a salary, and I began to be the paddle pilgrim, going on adventures on bodies of water around the world. So keep that in mind, because that really sort of summarizes my spirit as I go on these adventures. One of my students, I was still teaching at the time, read some of the stories to her little boys about going along the Erie Canal. And so she and the boys drew their map. I like this map a lot better. It has a lot of the markers. And in my book, which tells the story in much more detail, you'll hear more about that later. This map is included so you can see some of the highlights and some of the images along the Erie Canal. I launched in Tonawanda. Tonawanda is kind of a suburb in a sense of Buffalo. Fortunately, they had paddler friendly loading docks. And one of the things I've worked on ever since I paddled the canal is working with towns along the canal to have these kinds of more paddle friendly docks. As I often say, the hardest thing probably in kayaking is not the kayaking, but it's getting in and out of the kayak. So I launched in Tonawanda and I headed in the wrong direction. I found out later from a fellow who took a picture of me as I was paddling. He asked, "Where are you going?" I said, "To New York City." And he said, "Oh, you're going in the wrong direction." Well, it turns out he was a photographer for the Buffalo newspaper and was looking for an article and a picture. And so he posted an article in the Buffalo paper the next day. And a little later, that resulted in a very good encounter a little further along the canal. As I paddled along the canal, these banks of the canal were seeping water, and I paddled under it just to kind of have an initiation of baptism as I was beginning my journey down the Erie Canal. Along the Erie Canal, as you're probably aware, there are many locks, and you pass through these locks. Actually, it's a very fun experience. You can basically, I use my marine radio, but there's usually a cord you can pull or a rope you can pull, and you ask to lock through. And there are currently 35 locks on the Erie Canal. The original canal, which I'll talk more about later and have some pictures of, there were well over 100 locks along the canal, which was a much smaller and narrower body of water. But going through a lock is actually a fun experience, and you get to meet the lock tenders, who are local citizens and very friendly and very hospitable. Beautiful weather. The time of year was early fall, the last weekend of September and the first couple of weeks of October. I did that for the fall color. I did it for not encountering the hot and humid weather that the East Coast can throw your way, as well as hopefully not too many mosquitoes. And I was very successful. And as I was paddling along in one direction, a dad and his son were paddling by in the other direction. And we greeted each other and had a good conversation, and they headed off the other way. One of my first encounters with what I call canal angels or river angels or fjord angels was with Jessica. Jessica was sitting on a rock fishing, and I said, "So, how's the fishing?" She said, "Not too good." I said, "What are you fishing for?" She said, "Well, I'm really fishing for a bird." And I thought, "What?" She said, "Well, I work for the Department of Fisheries, and I have a cormorant that was injured, and I'm nursing the cormorant back to health. And so I go out fishing first thing in the morning to catch fish to feed the bird so that I can release the bird." And the reason I call these folks angels is along all the bodies of water, and it's true of trails and for people that hike, you meet people who very often are very friendly and helpful. And so you'll meet more of these canal angels. Jessica happened to be the first one. The second canal angel was John. Uh, John, actually, I met on the canal. He was walking the towpath, which is where the mules that pulled the boats um, used to walk, and now is a wonderful bicycle and walking path. And he pointed out to me. He said, "I know you." And I said, "How do you know me?" He said, "Your picture was in the Buffalo paper this morning." And I thought, "Oh my goodness! I just hope they didn't say wrong way Ellingson, paddling the wrong direction." But nonetheless, he said, "Are you thirsty?" Now, it was not terribly cold or hot. It was just the right time. He said, "We're having a festival in our little town called Medina, and it's called Ale in Autumn." So I paddled, met him at the dock, set up my little campsite for that night. And for the next few hours, John Slack and I walked all the way down Main Street, and every little store in town had set up a little bar, and I got to sample some of the best microbrew beverages in this town of Medina. A great way to begin the journey. Now, in that town, I walked around a little bit. I always want to see what the towns are like. And this was a fairly representative building. But what is unique about it, other than the architecture, is that the stones in it, the bricks in it, are quarried near this town of Medina. They had mines and quarries there for what came to be known as brownstone. And if you're familiar with New York City, there are whole neighborhoods, oftentimes now very affluent neighborhoods in New York City, that are brownstone homes. And so it was really kind of neat to kind of get the history. This town's economy was based on mining this beautiful stone or these bricks, sending them to New York and helping to build the city of New York. Another person I met in another little town down the canal was Roberto, and this is the town of Brockport. In this particular town, they had a visitor center. You can see it there in the left of the photo. I was paddling, and I set up my tent right there. Roberto was pedaling, and he had pedaled all the way to Buffalo, from Buffalo to Albany, and then back to Buffalo. He lived across the border in Canada and is a serious bicycle rider. And he gave me lots of tips about how to navigate the water and to good places to stay. And so I dubbed him, if I'm the paddle pilgrim, he's the pedal pilgrim. As I paddled along, I would often see on the water the replicas of the boats that traveled along the canal, known as packet boats. And you'll see more pictures of these boats later. But here was a group of Michiganders, three couples who had rented one of these packet boats. You don't need any particular license. Very easy to run, very slow putt motor. They sleep aboard. They had bicycles on top. You can rent these. And so I was paddling and they were putting, and we played leapfrog down the canal as we were both enjoying this beautiful area of upstate New York. One of the lock tenders, this is Jerry. When you get to these locks, the lock tenders, as I said, become very friendly and helpful. In this case, it was a very slippery, green, slimy ramp. And so he helped to pull mine up, and I camped right next to the canal. I camped most nights in my tent. And because the locks and the areas around the locks are technically state property, it's public property. So you can camp anywhere along the canal. And I took full advantage of that for my camping. That same lock, a little bit later, one of the tugs came through. And I had to get this picture because I had read a lot in preparation for the journey about the history of the area, and you'll hear more about it. But perhaps the most important and influential figure in the imagining and politicking and creating of the Erie Canal is DeWitt Clinton, who had been the mayor of New York and the governor of New York, and who had lobbied for this canal so that the water from the Hudson could connect to the Great Lakes. And he was criticized. It was called Clinton's Ditch or Clinton's Folly. And as you see along the journey, it actually was a brilliant piece of architectural engineering work and economic development. And I honor the memory of DeWitt Clinton because he had the vision for an infrastructure bill. We talk about that a lot these days, and his infrastructure was often called later one of the eighth wonder of the world. One of the little towns along the canal, as part of their economic development, actually built a little harbor. You can see over on the right side my kayak and my tent and the rampway I walked up. I was really glad to get off the canal and be able a kind of a safe place to camp. And this was in the town of Palmyra. As I walked up the ramp, I found a cafe called the Muddy Waters. And again, you never know exactly what you're going to encounter, but I was delighted to find this cafe that had wonderful food and a room full of canal hosts. This little town has organized a number of its citizens to greet people as they're coming along the canal. And my kayak was the only one, and so I got a lot of attention and a lot of great questions and comments. And as I sat there and talked with them and had a delicious meal, I learned a lot about the history of this area because this area around, particularly Palmyra, is known as the Burnt Over District. I hope you can see that. I'll try to identify. You can have to imagine the canal there running all the way over to the Hudson. But there were a number of religious and spiritual groups that emerged in this area during that time in the 19th century. Probably the most famous were the Mormons, and Joseph Smith discovered his tablets in a field outside of Palmyra. The other groups that I've listed there are the Shakers, Millerites, and different kinds of groups that arose at that time. And I'll try to explain that history. It got called the Burnt Over District because to many of the citizens, the message of what was sometimes called then the Second Great Awakening was hellfire and brimstone. But these groups were formed, and I'll try to explain a little bit more why there were many positive things that actually came out of this area that I was paddling through. Hard to believe, but this fellow doesn't look very happy, but his name is Charles Grandison Finney. And he's often described as the father of the Second Great Awakening. And he because during the canal, it was the area became like the Wild West. And there was, like in the Wild West, this was the wild northeastern area of New York. And so the crime and the drunkenness and the thievery and the murders. I mean, it was a very dangerous place as the canal was being built. And he, as a member of the one of the churches in the area, wanted to reform the area and to bring healing and hope and good news. The story continues for him. Some of you may have heard of Oberlin College. Well, he was the first president and founded Oberlin College, and the Oberlin College theme was caring for the world and reaching out to people. So yes, it was kind of hellfire and brimstone, but given what was going on, think of our world today and the law and order movement, which is reborn in the post pandemic lawlessness in many, many places. Don't want to get too much into politics here, but it was intriguing to get to know about this and the religious groups that emerged. Many, many, many bridges. This was a railroad bridge. I love bridges. And this is one of the many, many railroad bridges, hundreds of bridges across the Erie Canal. The most famous, of course, are the ones in the song Low Bridge. Those are the bridges that go up and go down so they can be multifunctional. Believe there are about 17 of those. Cars can drive across when it's down. It goes up, and there's just enough room under those bridges for me to paddle under, even when they're closed. But larger boats have to wait for those bridges to open up to get underneath. Under one of the bridges were several murals. There's actually several art contests in this area, and one of the areas were creating visual images of the history of the Erie Canal. And you can see actually three images here fairly well. This was the design and building of the canal. This was a packet boat going by a house loaded with barrels. I wonder what was in those barrels. And then here's another one that had, it looks more like grain or large boxes being pushed by one of the barges. Art. I'm a person who loves art, and I love my favorite kind of art is not just that created by humans, but created by the natural world. And here was a tree that had blown over or washed away years and years ago, and for who knows how long, the wind and the waters of the canal have been sculpting this piece. And as I paddle along the canal, I would stop. I'd be drawn to not only towns and people, but to these beautiful creations along the canal banks. This particular one, I was waiting to get into a lock, and the leaves were falling and blowing into, and my first thought was, I'm being squeezed by a bunch of refuse. And then I thought for a moment, I thought, oh no, this is an incredible collage of fall colors. And you think about a different perspective than seeing the natural world as being a problem to be solved, but an area in which to enjoy how creative and beautiful it can be. As I was paddling in the early going in the upper reaches of the Erie Canal, it's farm country. And the probably most popular agricultural item in upstate New York is apples. So on the dashboard of my kayak as I'm paddling along, I took a big bite out and paddled a little more and took a picture just to remember that particular place in upstate New York. And as I was thinking about it, I thought, my family actually had some history in orcharding in Washington State, where I live near Seattle. And I realized, oh my goodness, this is Johnny Appleseed country. And so before I switched to a little on Johnny Appleseed, I was showing this slideshow, this PowerPoint, to a group of grade school kids, and a young girl in one of the classes said, Mr. Ellingson, do you see it? And I thought, what do you mean? She said, look at the apple. It's shaped in a heart. And I thought, you know, but for the eyes of a child to see something that I had missed. I was seeing the big picture, and she was seeing a heart that my chompers had created in this apple. I went through a lot of pictures of Johnny Appleseed, and this was kind of my favorite because as I traveled through the area, and as I remember as a boy, we many of us probably saw the Walt Disney cartoonish version. But I was curious. So I've done more research on Johnny Appleseed, and like many legends, they begin with history, and Johnny Appleseed was a historical figure. John Chapman grew up in Massachusetts, had a love of the natural world, but particularly of apples. And he set off, in fact, historically, through the area of upstate New York and over into the Ohio River Valley, and is purported to have gotten all the way to Minnesota and Wisconsin. And he had a bag along with him of apple seeds, and he was ahead of most of the pioneers. And so he'd find a place where settlers might at some point settle. And apparently, he got along with Native American people pretty well. He was a non-threatening figure. And by the time many of these folks had arrived who were going to settle in those areas, there were a bunch of apple trees. And so he was a historical figure. He traveled. He lived very, very, very simply. He reminds me of John Muir plus apples. And he apparently was influenced by a Swedish theologian named Swedenborg, who was a mystical teacher who boiled down all religion, particularly Christianity, to helping people. And so Johnny Appleseed, the story gets better with each telling. In as I left a little town with the name Weedsport, I would try to be up early, and the sun was just coming up. And fortunately, I was able to capture the canal, which, as you can see, is much more like a river. And I'll talk more about that history of the three iterations of the canal a little bit. But this was a very special moment as the day began. Further down the canal, you come to a large lake, Lake Oneonta, and it's 23 miles across, and beautiful, beautiful area, but also known for its big storms and dangerous paddling. Fortunately, I had a calm day. I skirted the shores and made it across, paddling hard and nonstop to Sylvan Beach State Park, where I camped for the night before heading down the canal the next day. But a beautiful, beautiful sunset about halfway down the canal. About this area, and just another canal away, um, which which began in the 1840s in Seneca Falls. Many of us probably read a bit about the famous suffragettes, the most famous probably being Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They gathered and created a declaration essentially of the rights and responsibilities of women in a larger vision. Think about 1845, and they gathered and wrote a number of documents, but they didn't just write documents, they took to the streets. And this was a little later in the century, but it captures some of the spirit of these women who really launched the women's movement long before women's liberation, as we know it, became front page news. And so, as I paddled through this area, I keep thinking Johnny Appleseed, the burnt over district, Charles Grandison Finney. There's so much history in upstate New York, along the Erie Canal and along its shores. Fortunately, right in that area, I had gotten to know some of the leaders of the Canal Corporation. And one of them, Grit Savage, who was the operations manager of the canal, he had graciously offered for me to hitchhike on one of the tugboats. And so we threw my kayak on the back of the Grand Erie and traveled from Sylvan Beach to Utica. And I had a wonderful, he invited me there. He said, we've got an extra hotel room at the Utica Hotel. And it was a big old historic hotel in Utica. So I traveled with this group of wonderful people who maintain the canal and who were traveling on their annual inspection down the canal to make sure everything is working well. And just the mechanics of the canal is a story in itself, because there are so many different kinds of technologies used in those 35 locks. But I had a great day traveling along. The fellow in the middle is Jeff, and we had stopped at this particular lock, and I was taking pictures of them doing their inspection work. Here I am on the front of this is the largest of the canal tugboats, and a powerful craft. There are a number of them, and they travel up and down the canal to do repair work and to visit communities, and quite often to stop in schools so that kids can learn the history as well. Further along the canal, not all the days were sunny. This particular day, as I launched from the town of St. John's Port, it was foggy and frankly, both beautiful and a bit eerie. As I paddled out into the water, I I I would often sing when I'd be in foggy areas so people would hear my voice. And the sun came up maybe about an hour later and it cleared. But this is one of my favorite pictures because it reminds me of some of the wonderful Japanese art when I visited Japan and traveled. I loved the art of various cultures, and this reminds me of some of the Japanese art that I appreciate. Along the canal, there were historic sites, and in this particular case, pulled up to the edge and stopped to see the local canal. This is what the original canal looked like, with over 100 locks. It was 4 feet deep. You can see that it isn't in this case, but it was 4 feet deep and 40 feet wide. And if you notice to the right, there is kind of a passageway to the side. That is where when boats would be competing for lock space, if a packet boat was going in it wanting to pass it, it would pull to the side, sort of like a side track for a train passing, and then it would go through the lock. But this is an example. And along the Erie Canal, there are a number of these historic sites that you can visit and see. Now, just so you know, the time of the Erie Canal, DeWitt Clinton, you remember DeWitt Clinton, his visionary work, they were learning as they were going. They had never really built a canal like this before. The Brits had, in their coal mining areas, built canals. The French had built canals. There had been a number of canals, but the U.S. had never done it. Now, Jefferson and Washington in the Chesapeake had wanted to create a canal, of course, right by their property. Unfortunately for them, there were these mountains, the Alleghenies. And so as the dream of a canal to the Midwest or to the Great Lakes came to fruition after many years of politicking and arm twisting and DeWitt Clinton's hard work, the first canal was built. It was started in 1818 and it was finished in 1825. Then about 40 years later, as trains began to come through the area, the canal's use went down, and they built a broader and wider canal, and then it was added to one more time in the early 20th century. That's why what you see me paddling on in most cases is more like a small river. There are still locks, still dams. It's navigable, The canal is open from right about now. It's closed in the winter. It's open now soon and will be open until the middle of October. And that's how I planned my end of September to the middle of October uh, period of time. Now, just the economics. In that time of the early Erie Canal, if you were to travel by stagecoach between Albany and Buffalo, it would take 2 weeks. On the Erie Canal, loaded with gear, with merchandise, and with people, you could do it in 5, 6 days, maybe 7 days at the most. And you can see the savings in time and the savings in cost. So this was an enormous economic boom, as well as a place that allowed immigrants, including my own immigrant ancestors who came from Norway in the 1850s. They came up the Hudson, across the Erie Canal to the Great Lakes, and ended up settling as farmers in Wisconsin and Iowa. I included this picture. I should probably have put it in where I was talking about the burnt over district. Along the canal, there were grocery stores. Obviously, there wasn't much in many of these areas, and you can see the canal in the foreground. As I read about this, and I didn't know this until the time, it was a grocery store by day. Guess what it was at night? It was a pretty raucous saloon. And so the religious folks who were concerned about their area and what was going on, one of the things I think that motivated them to have kind of a religious revival, right? And was these places along the canal that became gathering places, which they found to be not to their liking in terms of people living their lives and with families and kids nearby. So anyway, this was right along the canal at that same place where you saw the other picture. I snagged this picture off of the internet. Shows one of the mule drivers and a couple of mules pulling a packet boat. This essentially is the way the Erie Canal functioned. Now, iteration two, not the narrow one, but the next iteration in the second half of the 19th century. And so it would carry people, it would carry business goods, mercantile, etc., up and down the Erie Canal. I included this picture. I tried to find and was unable to find, and I'm going to continue looking. But this picture captured for me the challenge that slaves fleeing bondage in the South. It kind of captures that spirit for me of traveling by night. And as we well know, the Underground Railroad shepherded thousands of people through the slave states and further north, and became actually quite famous along the Erie Canal because it was a route where people could follow the canal. But again, I heard this from locals and I've read about it as well. Very often, if a sympathetic barge captain or packet boat captain, he would lift up the floorboards in the bottom of a packet boat and he'd hide runaway slaves under the boards of one of these boats and transport them all the way up almost to Canada to their freedom. And so again, as I was traveling along the canal, I kept thinking about all of this history that was going on and all of it that's woven together and comes very much alive as you travel along the Erie Canal. We're now in a lower stretch of the Erie Canal. One of the reasons this area was selected was it's actually a river. It's called the Mohawk River. It's a beautiful, beautiful river. And so now I actually had a bit of current to help me along as I'm paddling. The leaves are turning. The area is bigger. I encountered more wind and weather. It was getting colder, but it was absolutely a gorgeous area to paddle through. And I was about the only person I saw most days. Finally, towards the end of the Erie Canal, this was a dam, not really a lock, but a dam used in flood conditions that opens at the beginning of what are called the flight of locks. There are there's such an increase, or in my case, a decrease of going down over this area. There are 5 locks within a very, very short area called the flight of locks. So you go through a lock, you go through a lock, you go, I mean, and so for 5 different locks to get you down, all the way down to the town of Waterford, which is the last town. This is Waterford on the Erie Canal. You can see here, I mean, my little kayak was tied up, but there were a lot of sailboats, other craft, a lot of actually yachts traveling down the Erie Canal that time of year. They had been sailing in the Great Lakes during the summer, and then as the weather changes, they take the Erie Canal down the Hudson River, and then the East Coast inland waterway to the Caribbean. So I actually had great conversations with a number of these folks. In fact, I forgot some gear in one of the towns, and I called back to the visitor center, and they said, "Oh, there's a boat out here. We found your gear." And so a couple of hours later, a big old trimaran yacht came pulling up alongside with my gear. So we had our little courier service and another case of canal angels helping me out. This is the last lock at Troy. As you can see, the wind, it was cold, kind of, even though it was sunny, it was in the upper 30s. And so I was beginning to think, I want to get to the Statue of Liberty soon. Well, fortunately, I had met some wonderful people along the Erie Canal. She is the head of the Albany Visitor and Convention Bureau, um, and he was an advertising exec. And they said, when you get to Troy, call us. Well, they put me up in a really nice hotel, and so here I am in a hotel for a night, enjoying a hot fireplace and checking the tide tables. And that's in the foreground, my journal, because I write in my journal every day what's been happening. And the reason I have to check the tide tables is the Hudson River is a tidal river. Um, it was carved in the last ice age, so it's very deep, and so it's deep enough that there's actually a tidal flow all the way up past Albany. So I had to calculate when the river was flowing down, and I would jump in the river at usually mid morning during the ebb, and would ride the tide, which helped a bit. And so I was checking the tide table because I was in for a totally new experience from here on down. Another river angel, this case, this is Scott. Scott is the head of the Hudson River Greenway, and it turns out is a paddler. So when I go on these adventures, I do research, I contact people, and he came down to the dock in Albany just to greet me and to say hello. And he's created an app. So there are now really good, not only physical maps, but good apps. So if a person wants to bike or paddle or canoe or whatever, any of these waterways, those apps are available online to help with places to camp along the way, with places to stop for food, etc. So another river angel. Here's the bigger river. Right after I launched, fortunately, it was a very calm day and a fairly nice day. But you know, they say in Norway, the reality is you can experience 4 seasons in one day on the fjords. Well, the same is true on the Hudson River. As I went down through Rip Van Winkle country, the wind turned, and I was heading into a headwind, a very strong headwind, and a cold headwind. You can see a yacht over here to the right. Well, they're motoring along, and I actually got closer to shore to get out of the wind as I paddled down through blustery conditions on the Hudson River. I add this little story. I had read before I went on this journey a wonderful book by a local author. I'm sure many of you have read the book and have now seen the movie, The Boys in the Boat. Well, this is the bridge at Poughkeepsie where the 1936 University of Washington crew team paddled under to win the berth representing the United States at the 1936 Olympics in Germany. And so I write in my book a little essay about the boys in the boat, and very often my books tell about what I'm seeing, but they also then reflect a little on the historical or the perhaps the spiritual meaning. So I got a great image from the internet of the boys in the boat. These are the scrawny guys. If you haven't read the book, do. If you haven't seen the movie, do. It tells a wonderful story of a bunch of regular, down to earth guys, not blue bloods. They beat the bloods from Yale and Harvard and Cal, but they were just regular guys. They were the second team at UW, and they beat the first team. Then they beat all the U.S. teams to go to Berlin, and then they beat all the teams in the world to win the gold medal. It's a great story. The designer of their boat. I have a quote from him. His name is George Yeomans Pocock. He describes this experience of paddling, and I've done some paddling as well as paddling of crew. He says it's a great art, rowing. It's the finest art there is. It's a symphony of motion, and when you're rowing well, why, it's nearing perfection. And when you near perfection, you're touching the divine. It touches the you of yous, which is your soul. Oh, as I paddled under the bridge, tears formed in my eyes. Well, as I traveled along, there are train tracks on both sides of, of the Hudson River. I pulled over near Marlborough and set up my tent and my kayak. And I was awakened many times during the night because the trains would come rumbling by. I was awakened and couldn't get back to sleep at 4 o'clock in the morning when one train stopped on the road and the bell signaling for cars kept going off for over an hour. So I finally gave up and just lay in my tent. But I was in for a wonderful surprise when someone came and they knocked on the picnic table next to it as a way of saying, is there anybody in there, or do you like coffee, was the question. It wasn't like my friend John in Medina. And I said, I love coffee. I'm from Seattle. Well, this is my friend in Marlborough who invited me up to his house. His name is Daniel, and that's his little dog, Chrissy. And he just lives up the hill, and we had a wonderful breakfast, got to know Daniel, still in touch with Daniel, and he's leading in that little area a restoration of the old railway station. And so I've actually gone back on a speaking tour back there, and now it's a place for community gatherings. And I've spoken in the museum as it's now been restored, and they have a beautiful dock they've built for small vessels traveling up and down the river. So another river angel. As I traveled along, I hoped I would run into the Clearwater. If you're familiar with the Hudson River, you'll know it's the river plied by a very, very famous folk singer, Pete Seeger. He usually keeps his boat, the Clearwater, in Beacon, but he had gone all the way up the river further with a crew of young people. By this time, Pete had passed away, but he was a hero to me as I was growing up with his music, folk music. And so I got to know the young people on the Clearwater in this little town across the river from West Point. So I camped right there and enjoyed just thinking about the great music that Pete and his wife made. They traveled up and down Hudson River in the Clearwater doing environmental work, and probably more than anybody have helped to clean up the waters of the Hudson River for people to enjoy. Well, now I'm getting into the waters of big boats. Actually, fairly large vessels like this can go almost all the way up to Albany. But this vessel now signals being a little more on the lookout so that I'm not going to be encountering any dangerous encounters, mainly not so much from being hit, but from the wakes that they throw up. The weather was not particularly pleasant. Uh, Headwinds, actually bits of snow and sleet. I had to take a picture because sometimes people see my adventures and they think they're these romantic adventures. And there are plenty of moments when I stop and say, why in the world am I doing this? From the retrospect and perspective of looking back, I can romanticize, but when you're out there and it's cold, I just hung on to a dock for a while and then regained my composure and headed back out on the water. But soon came to one of my favorite places. This is the Bear Mountain Bridge. When I lived in Dobbs Ferry, New York, we would camp up near the Bear Mountain Bridge. The Hudson River narrows at this point, and so there was a flow, a current in the Hudson that allowed me to actually hold on to my paddle and travel at 4 or 5 knots for about an hour. So I just savored it, and as you probably discovered, when I'm really enjoying things, I start singing. Well, I got to Ossining, and I followed a yacht. I was wondering, where am I going to camp here? And very often you follow someone in their boat, and this guy was Mick. He was in a nice sailboat, and I said, Mick, is there any place I can camp? He said, yeah, we've created an area for kayaks. Come on over here. So I brought my kayak and camped in Ossining. Those of you who know history of New York, um, right downriver from here is the Sing Sing prison, which I remember growing up in New York was the place that seemed so scary because some of the most criminals, most famous or infamous criminals in the world would be sent to Sing Sing. So I got to camp, and Mick became a friend. And actually, when I did my book tour back along the Hudson and the Mississippi, I did a program for them at the Chattamook Yacht Club. It was the name of the place. Well, this was during the construction of the new bridge. When I was growing up and living in Dobbs Ferry, they were building what was called the Tappan Zee Bridge, crossing and it was at the time, I think, if not the longest, one of the longest suspension bridges in the world. We could hear the pilings going on through day and night. Well, the new bridge was going in, and I'm fortunately my friends who were helping me on the journey I had a marine radio, and I was able to talk with them and my cell phone because as I was traveling along, there were some stretches, particularly Scott Keller with the Hudson River Greenway. He told me to stay to the left-hand side, left bank, and there's some platforms here. I don't have it in this slideshow, but there were a whole bunch of construction workers. I watched for big boats coming through, and the construction workers, when I came alongside here, they all came to the edge and kind of cheered for me and said, "Oh, you can go through now." And so I patched out and peeled through the bridge and got through the Tappan Zee and made it down now close to where I lived as a boy, Dobbs Ferry. Well, here's a picture of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Sleepy Hollow is a little town north of Dobbs Ferry where I live. It's the home of Washington Irving, who is probably one of the most famous writers of the period. His short story, or really kind of a poem, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, is very famous. Another of his very famous writings was about Rip Van Winkle, the man who slept for all those years and woke up in a new world. But so I paddled by and I was kind of curious because I remember as a boy, probably Disney had turned this into a movie, probably cartoonish. But as I did more research, and some of you may know this from your own educational experience, but there are different theories as to who the Headless Horseman was, who terrorizes the naive school teacher Ichabod Crane on his way home from a Halloween party at the home of the Van Tassels, where he's been courting their beautiful young daughter, and who has rejected his outreach to her. Well, he's heading back through Sleepy Hollow, and he's chased by a headless horseman. Historically, probably the most popular theory is that there was a Russian soldier, or a Hessian soldier, not a Russian soldier, a Hessian soldier during the Revolutionary War, who in this area had his head shot off by a cannonball. And so over the years, the legend began to grow that on Halloween, the Headless Horseman would travel through this area looking for his head. The more popular theory that I subscribed to was the other suitor of Van Tassel daughter, Brom Bones. I think he dressed up, and to get rid of any competition for this young woman, he dressed up like the Headless Horseman and chased Ichabod Crane out of the area. But I just thought about that, and I remember as a child traveling through that area and then seeing the movie, and it was one of those scary kinds of stories you never forget. As we go down a little further, I got to Yonkers. Yonkers Canoe Club. The oldest canoe, and it's called a canoe club, but it's canoes, kayaks, all sorts of water craft, surrounded by big, big, tall buildings. They're battling to keep their ancient old canoe and kayak shed there right on the water. I'm glad that they kept it. I was greeted by their Commodore, who opened the doors to me to stay. And inside, where there was like a wonderful collection of boats of the members of the club. So I set up my tent inside in my sleeping bag, and I had a delight. I felt like I was sort of in the Hall of Fame, because on the walls they had pictures of Olympians, famous paddling athletes who had won gold medals at Olympics. And I got to kind of grace this cathedral of kayaking. It was just a wonderful evening. The next morning, I took off, and of course, not far away, you can see the Manhattan skyline there under the bridge. This is the George Washington Bridge, which was the first really big bridge I remember as a boy. But what I really remember is the Palisades, which is across from it's just a big bluff and there was an amusement park up on top. Now, I hope I put this picture back in. No, I guess I didn't. I actually have a picture of the Little Red Lighthouse. If some of you were children, and you might have read a wonderful story about a lighthouse, which is right under the pilings of the George Washington Bridge. I had to paddle across the river through the traffic to get a good picture of the Little Red Lighthouse, in one of my favorite childhood stories. To my left, I'm on the Jersey shore, paddling along the Palisades to stay away from all the traffic, because the closer you get to Manhattan, the more traffic there is, not only larger vessels, but a lot of taxis, water taxis, tour boats. So I stayed on the Joysey side of the river. And finally came around the bend to the Statue of Liberty, and got as close as I could before the police directed me to leave the protected area. The security on the water, unless you're a part of a tour group, is pretty strong. And so I got as close as I could, took a picture, and thought back over the 3 weeks now that I had actually been paddling the Erie Canal and the Hudson River. And there I am, my friend who was going to pick me up soon and put my big boat on her little car. I was paddling along the jetty by Jersey City, which has now grown up. It looks almost like Manhattan. It's population huge in both cases, but glad to be through with the adventure. And as I think about that today, just historically, we all probably know the famous poem, the inscription on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, the poem by Emma Lazarus. Give me your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. The message which we need to remember to immigrant groups that we are a land of immigrants. My ancestors came through these waters in 1853, and people still want to become members of our great American society. And so this was a reminder at the end of my journey of how liberty applies to everybody, and I was free on my adventure. Two books to end my presentation, and I'll be glad to do some Q&A or hear some comments. This is probably the best single volume I would encourage you to read. It's called The Wedding of the Waters, the Erie Canal and the Making of a Great Nation by Peter Bernstein. This fellow follows from well before the building of the canal to Jefferson and Washington imagining a Chesapeake Canal, and then the political and economic development of all the various groups, and then the actual building of the canal and what it meant for the opening of the West, which included my ancestors who came that route to settle in the Midwest. Several million people traveled the Hudson and the canal to farm in the verdant, green, and deep soils of Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin. So I commend it. It's very, very well written. It's history that is very engaging. And then, of course, personal plug for one of my Paddle Pilgrim books. This goes into a lot more detail with a lot of reflection, some of which you've heard and then others you've not. So this is available at Amazon. It's also available on my website, paddle-pilgrim.com. And I will be glad to send you an autographed copy or send to someone else if you order it through my website, paddle-pilgrim.com. And basically, that is the journey with one final comment. Long ago, I think his name was Mark Twain. He said, 20 years from now, you will be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did. So throw away the bow lines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, and discover. Thanks for joining me on my adventure. I now look forward to any questions or comments you may have. And take it away, Ben.
Dave, thank you, thank you, thank you. This so much from the Canal Angels to you finding that you're a paddling pilgrim, but there are pedaling pilgrims and putt-putt pilgrims also on the journey along with you. A reminder, folks who are tuning in live to this program, we're taking questions in the Q&A section on the Zoom webinar. And if you're watching on the JES's Facebook page, we're taking questions and comments in the comment section on this post. Dave, I want to start with one of mine because I'm really curious about this of, setting out on this journey. I'm sure with all of the preparation you did and in the thinking and the planning and being ready for that, I'm curious what you might have encountered along the way that went exactly as you expected it to, whether it was easy or difficult, what you thought, oh yes, this is exactly what I anticipated. But then conversely, what surprised you? Perhaps what you weren't planning for or something that you planned for that just went differently. So what went just according to plan, and what surprised you on this journey?
Well, they're been sort of flip sides of the same coin. On the one hand, I've had enough experience with river angels and that they're wonderful people you have along the way, but they mean so much because you need them because the best laid plans of mice and men, right? Um, you plan and say, I'm going to make it to this lock by this time because the lock closes at 8 o'clock. Well, you don't make it to that lock and you're stuck. And you can say, well, where am I going to go? Well, I paddled ashore in a number of cases and thinking, it's dark, I'm cold, I'm tired. And then all of a sudden you meet somebody on the bank and they say, do you need a place to stay? And it's like, absolutely. And you get a meal and a shower and a new friend. And so I like to think of it this way that a lot of things that I didn't count on, whether it's colder weather or whether it's um, just they the weather was oftentimes the biggest challenge because you'd get these headwinds, and that's kind of a metaphor, and it's also a reality. When you're a paddler, you think like when I paddled the Mississippi, you got the current that's pushing you down. Well, yeah, but not much, and you get these headwinds, and you're paddling so hard you're not even making progress. And so for me, it's the flip side of all the elements of weather and the struggles you have when you like I was getting out of my kayak in one of the little towns and I pulled up my rudder on the back and all of a sudden it fell off. And so it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Well, there was a guy walking by. His name is Dan. I talk about him in the book. And fortunately the rudder is attached by a cable, so I'm pulling it up, and all that happened was there was a little cotter pin holding it in place. And so he says, oh, tie yourself up and come on up. Well, I walked up the street. He's a junior high social studies teacher, Dan, the canal angel. And he brings out a toolkit, just a little portable toolkit. We fix it. And then I'm about to head out. He says, are you hungry? I said, yeah. He said, well, come on in for dinner. So I meet his family. And as I'm leaving to go back and then camp out, he says, why don't you just take that toolkit with you because you're going to need these tools. And they were better tools than I had. So, I mean, I don't want to make it sound like it always works, but the other thing maybe that surprises me is there is just so much wonderful history there in that area of along the Erie Canal. I knew some of it because I learned it as a kid in grade school, but until you're on the water and you're singing Low Bridge and actually going under a low bridge, you just don't realize what an amazing historical corridor it is.
So two great follow-up questions coming in from folks. I think that speak right to that. One's on history, one's on gear. I'm going to go with the history question first, and then we'll talk about the gear. The history question is people heard during the presentation a lot from Johnny Appleseed to the Underground Railroad to the boys in the boat and so much more. We also heard how at times emotional those moments filled you, and how you felt. What moved you the most? If you could pick one moment, one place, where did you feel moved the most from the history? Whether that was spiritually moved, emotionally moved, what really took you out of the moment and helped you see the you in you the most?
I'd say there were two things. One, and this was a constant, I kept thinking of my great grandparents who had come up the Hudson and the Erie Canal. And I actually in another of my books, I talk about how I heard voices when I was on the canal, and the voices had a Norwegian accent, and they were saying, come to Norway, come and paddle the fjords of Norway. And that's why my next adventure was on the fjords of Norway. But as I was traveling along, I talk about the cloud of witnesses. I talk about the ancestors, whether they Native American people when I've paddled on the Mississippi or my Norwegian ancestors. I talk to my ancestors. Some people think I'm crazy, but I'm glad I have that that mob of crazy people who left the fjords of Norway and came to America and came. So I'm talking to these folks along the way. So that's always emotional for me because they're very real. So when you think of Johnny Appleseed, well, Johnny Appleseed's spirit is along the canal, right? And the boys in the boat, they're all along that stretch of the river. And so I guess that is both physical, emotional, and spiritual all rolled into one.
Dave, I really appreciate that, and I find you're not alone when I'm on hikes or I've got a chance to be in nature. I feel like most often if I'm alone, I'm talking to my dad, you know, and I talk to others in my family who've passed in a way to connect with them. So I really appreciate that, and I suppose in a way it's them singing back to you, or at least being part of the chorus as you're singing out, you know, as you're paddling along the canal and other
Right,
waterways.
right.
So. To the gear question, folks are
Yeah.
curious, like how much did you pack and what did you have? Because even though it's a longer craft, and I don't think any of us are going to bust you for it, it's still a small craft, and you've got your tent. Now you've got a toolkit that you inherited along the way. What else did you have with you to make such a journey?
Well, I think one of the great gifts of these kinds of adventures is learning to travel light. I think we have too much stuff. And not just when we're on paddle adventures, but the one of the big lessons I always take is I put everything together, there's too much stuff. Then I thin it out again and there's still too much stuff. Then I go on the adventure and there's still too much stuff. So the question is, what is enough? What do I need? You know, and so I think that's the fundamental question. Now, my boat was a big boat. I could have taken a smaller boat, but that's actually the boat that took me down the Mississippi River. And I actually shipped it from Seattle with air freight for $150 to Buffalo because I could have rented a boat in Buffalo, but what would I have done with it when I got to New York City? Right? And so for $150, I bubble wrapped my 17 and a half foot wilderness experience. Tsunami is the name of the boat, which has a lot of storage space. And then I sent it to actually care of a paddling shop outside of Buffalo. And I said, it's going to come. I would like to have you pick me up at the airport, transport me to the dock in Tonawanda, and I'll pay you for that. So I paid him $100 or something. So I had another friend, right? And we launch and I take off. Tent, that's the camping gear is one piece of it. Clothes, I mean, it depends on the time of year, but I most of the time I can get by with very, very little, a couple of t-shirts, sweatshirt, rain gear, and I can wad it together in a little wad. I tend to use neoprene booties because I can get in and out of the boat and in the water, and they're a little warmer. And then I'll have Keen sandals, for hotter days. But if you buy the book, here's the bonus. In the back of my book is a list of the things. Now, I didn't come up with this list. But my friend Jim Lewis, who's paddled the fjords of Norway with me and the headwaters and has done the Mississippi, and he's also taken the Continental Divide north to Hudson Bay and paddled that. He's an engineer by profession, retired. And he has this spreadsheet, which I have in the back of the books, that isn't, don't take all that stuff, but it's kind of a checklist. I'll give you one quick example of one that I didn't have on my list, but I'm glad he had. We were paddling the headwaters and we stopped at this little campsite in northern Minnesota. And I was getting in and out of my boat, he noticed that there was a tick that had embedded itself right behind my knee, right? And, ticks have a way, we would do tick checks at night before we go to sleep, right? But it was right behind my knee. And impulsively, I just stuck my finger down and scratched it. Well, Lyme disease doesn't need a full tick. All it needs is the germs. And so he said, "Oh no!" And I looked down and I tried to pick all the pieces. He had a little tiny tweezer, so he picks all the pieces out. He then pulls out this surgical knife that he has and does this little operation on my leg. Blood is flowing down my leg. And I'm just grateful that I'm not going to die of Lyme disease. And he puts some super glue or some kind of bandage across it. And then he says, "Oh, you need to do one more thing." And he hands me this pill. It looked like a horse pill. And it was actually a pill designed basically to ward off Lyme disease. So this guy has put together a list of way too many things. So if you're going to go for a day journey, look at the list and pick a few. A week journey, pick a few more. But bottom line is travel as light and as simply as you can.
I appreciate the enough, like what is enough. So we have another audience question coming in asking how long in days was the trip from Buffalo to New York City? I remember I think you gave us time of year. You were in September, October. How long did this take you from Buffalo to New York City?
A little over 3 weeks. And in retrospect, were I to do it again, I would have added another week because I wanted to spend a little more time on the Hudson River. And so I was and it was getting colder, and I was having frost on my tent at night. And so I would have added one more week because it's 500 miles when you add it all together. So I would say 3 weeks. I did it, but I think 4 weeks would have been better.
Another question, and I know we're here focused on the Erie Canal, the Hudson
Sure.
River, in New York City, but you've mentioned them, I've mentioned them. Take us briefly to the fjords of Norway. What was that experience like?
Well, my ancestors, as I said, came to the U.S. In the mid 19th century. They came the canal, the river to the Midwest, and farmed. But I wanted to go back to the ancestral fjords. And I've been to Norway a number of times, but I had not paddled the fjords. So again, in my normal process, I began reading and, you know, doing research, and there wasn't a lot of information on kayaking the fjords of Norway. But I found two outfitters, and I contacted them, and we were able to actually rent our kayaks there with all the gear that we needed. And for about a month that we were again paddling, it was about $1,000, right? And they were very helpful. They actually transported us between the Hardanger and the Sogne Fjord, which are the two fjords that my ancestors were from. I was able to, again, there's something in Scandinavia called Allemanns retten, which means every man or every person's right. Translated into simple English is freedom to roam. There's a, a very strong emphasis or de-emphasis on private property. So you can camp really almost anywhere in Norway. There's etiquette. You tell the farmer, you tell the landowner, you don't camp in view of their house. You leave it as good as so we took full advantage of that. So we found campsites all over the place. We try to always locate near a waterfall just for the sound of the waterfall and to get fresh water to drink. Um, and we I planned it, but again, you plan something and it doesn't work out, or something happens, or you meet a person and you do a detour. And I have a line in my Norway movie that I don't actually know where I got it, but it's something like the true happiness is enjoying a detour. And so oftentimes those surprising serendipities that happen on your adventures, the things you don't plan that just happen, are the most memorable. And so I often write about them because they catch you by surprise. Like, for example, we were eating in a restaurant in Balestrand, which is a lovely community on a fjord. And so I walked into the restaurant and I saw a picture of Rick Steves on the door. Well, now Rick lives just a mile from where I live here in Seattle and is probably the most famous travel writer in America. Europe through the back door, and Rick Steves Europe, and he's just a wonderful human being. Well, Rick apparently had come to this town years before with a travel group, and there was a sausage stand that he fell in love with the lady in the sausage stand. Not fell in love, he fell in love with her sausages. And so he added to his tour books that they needed to stop and have a sausage in Ballastern. Well, that was all it took. And like 5 years later, Corolla is her name, and there's a picture of her in the book, opened the Vikinger Treff, and we had a wonderful, wonderful meal. I took a picture of her and me and texted it to Rick Steves and said, Rick, you have made Corolla very happy. And again, we just, it just happened. And so I think that's the best part of it. We want to plan everything, but if we're open to adventure, that's when we often learn the most.
Yeah, I couldn't agree enough with that, Dave. I mean, I think it's the perhaps American equivalent, or at least what I hear most often. It's not the destination, it's the journey. But I think of that in my own travels of, any of the restaurants that I've stopped to, eat a bite on the side of a road,
Right.
because, you're hungry and it's not because you've picked it out, or you decide to go a little bit farther on the trail, or you decide to go into town and shop and you meet people you otherwise would have never encountered. So I think that's really beautifully put. And then the impact of traveling along and being able to see such a moment, I think is so powerful. You also mentioned the mighty Mississippi. Take us down the river briefly, what that was like, and how that was perhaps most similar and different to the experience from the Erie Canal through the Hudson River up to New York City.
Well, I another part of my life was along the Mississippi. I was born in Minneapolis, and so I have a lot of roots in the Midwest, the farming communities, etc. So it was my Huck Finn adventure, and my favorite book, and I think the great American novel, is The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And so, if people haven't read the book recently, read it. It is there's, I mean, it's here's a runaway slave and a throwaway white kid traveling down the river, commenting on mid 19th century America with great perception and becoming friends. I mean, it's in so many ways. So for me, I always dreamt about going down the river. I figured a kayak would be better than a raft, but so I read a bunch of books, launched near Lake Itasca in northern Minnesota. Fortunately, had maybe my friend Jim Lewis from Grand Rapids is following this adventure on the webinar today, but he paddled with me actually from Itasca to Minneapolis and was kind of a coach and a guide for the early going through all sorts of conditions. It was, and I wrote a book about it, but I didn't intend to. It became a blog that expanded into a book. And then I was solo from Minneapolis. The early going is wilderness and just beautiful. And then from Minneapolis down, you have locks and dams like the Erie Canal. Obviously, it's a much bigger river. Weather plays a huge role. I mean, it was very cold in the early going. It was very hot, 115 degrees in Arkansas and Louisiana, and you're dodging these huge barges along the river. Fortunately, in my year, on one level, it was a drought year, so I had sandbars to camp on. So I camped on sandbars most of the way down the river. I know other people who've gone down in flood years and have had to string their hammocks between two trees and have water underneath their hammock to sleep at night. So, and again, the history of the area, the Native American history and the early going, the Ojibwe people, learning from them and their stories. Then you get into farm country, you get into the South, there's Civil War history. Every little town along the way River towns are fascinating. In fact, I'm thinking, excuse me, I'm thinking that my next adventure might be a bicycle ride down the whole Mississippi River Road and then stopping in these river towns over the course of a couple of months. So I really fell in love with the whole river and all the people. And oh man, the angels along the way, people I would never pick as friends. Oh my goodness. But they took care of me and they helped me in some dire circumstances, and I'm so grateful. It helps to open my mind in this day of so much arguing and anger and labeling of people. I mean, there were some, I'll say it gently, there were some redneck folk in the South that I would not pick as my friends, but they were the kindest, most helpful people, and I'm thankful that I got to know them and that they helped me get down the river.
As someone born in West Virginia and raised in southwestern rural Pennsylvania, I take no umbrage or offense to redneck, as mine is that color. My collar was blue. I think those are some of the kindest, nicest folks that I still
Indeed.
get to meet and be with. And I think again, there's something powerful about meeting the people that you otherwise wouldn't encounter. And I love the bit that you were telling us about. I immediately thought you were going to say somebody knocked on your tent, but of course you can't knock on a tent. So I love the
Right.
creative knocking on the picnic bench beside you saying, "Would you like some coffee? Do you like this? Does the person in there like coffee?" So, Dave, I wanted to ask what was next, and you told us, and I think that's excellent and exciting, and we can't wait to hear about the journey of biking the Mississippi River. You opened with a powerful quote from Mary Oliver. You talked about the Emma Lazarus poem on the Statue of Liberty, and here we have a quote from Mark Twain, and we've heard others throughout. What would you say is the most important Dave Ellingson words that we can conclude with tonight that you want folks to hold on to as they continue about the rest of their day and perhaps wake up tomorrow morning still thinking about your journey, the lessons learned, what you encountered, and how it might impact their life? What are the Dave Ellingson words that you want to end with?
Well, I'll start with again with Mary Oliver, another quote from her from another of her poems, where there's a line where she asks the question of the reader, "What then do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" And I would hope whoever's listening or viewing in their life, they don't. It doesn't have to be some adventure like I'm doing that's kind of wacky. I mean, maybe you decide the great adventure is being the best grandparent in the world. I mean, whatever it may be. But what then do you plan to do with your one wild and precious life, Mary Oliver? And then the line that I always close my correspondence with people is paddle boldly. Paddle boldly. Whatever you're doing, go for it and be open to the learning that you'll experience along the way, and I think you'll be a far happier and more fulfilled person in the process.
I couldn't agree more, Dave. I think from the Twain quote that we're looking at to what you just said from Mary Oliver to paddling boldly, I think of your earlier observation of, how much is too much, enough, just get by with enough, because I think throughout the time we have, we can certainly aspire to accumulate more, whether it's money, whether it's things, whether it's other objects, but the one thing that we are always getting less of is time. How do we spend it? What do you do with it? How do you invest in it yourself and others around you? And that can just being a great grandparent, which no doubt you are, amongst the many things, adventurer, author, speaker, pastor, master gardener, former distance runner, husband, father, and of course, grandfather, the Reverend Dr. Dave Ellingson. Thank you, thank you, thank you for inviting us along the journey, sharing your experience, stories, and knowledge with us. We are so appreciative. Dave, where can people find out more about you, your other journeys, your books, follow along the journey, and keep updated on journeys to come? Where do they tune into?
Well, my website, paddle-pilgrim.com, has information on my books, my films. I have a podcast. It has where I do speaking engagements, and so if folks whether they have a paddling organization or a historical group or a whatever it may be, and they're looking for a speaker. I do in person, obviously here in the Northwest, but I'm happy to Zoom with groups anywhere. And I do not just the Paddle Pilgrim presentations. I have a book of poetry. I have a book called Say What, which is about familiar expressions. I have a book about biblical wisdom. I have a children's book about some animals that live together and take care of each other. So whether it's about one of those topics or just joining in on the adventure of your organization, I'd be glad to talk with you.
And Dave, we can't wait to get you in person the next time you're in the Great Lakes, Mid-Atlantic, Appalachian, Rust Belt region of Erie, Pennsylvania. And I think maybe the easier question would have been, what don't you have? So folks can head over to paddlepilgrim.com dash in between there. And of course, we'll have more information on the JES's website to direct you there. But again, thank you, thank you, thank you, Dave. And of course, thank you all for tuning in, whether you were watching on the Zoom webinar or you were watching on the live stream on our Facebook page, or if you're streaming on demand this discussion at your leisure. We appreciate you, and we appreciate you keeping the conversation going. To tune in to all things JES, head over to our website, jeserie.org. There you will find videos of other past presentations available to stream on demand, other publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as information on other upcoming JES discussions, publications, and much, much more. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and connect with us on LinkedIn, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spagan. Thanks for listening and watching and learning with us.